Welcome to this special edition of Go Vote Omaha. This is a special topics interview presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Debbie Ford, a League member and the moderator for the interview. The League never supports or opposes political parties or candidates. We present this interview solely for voter education. As we begin the 2020 election season, we will be continuing to engage in conversations with our family, friends, and colleagues about challenging issues in our communities. Issues such as healthcare, immigration, education, and taxes, among many others, will come up in conversations at home, at work, and in community spaces. These issues can be difficult to discuss regardless of your political party. With us today is Mary Lee Brock, Assistant Professor in the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program at Creighton University. In our session today, Mary Lee will share with us ways of approaching these conversations that help us share ideas rather than polarize positions. Welcome, Mary Lee.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Please tell us about your background.
Well, I've been involved in the conflict field for about 25 years. Started by forming a community-based mediation and facilitation firm here in Omaha, working a lot with families that were making decisions about their children and how they were going to parent together from two homes, working with small businesses, elder care, did a lot of group facilitation and training. And then about 10 years ago, I joined the faculty at Creighton University to teach in our master's program in negotiation and conflict resolution.
Okay. How did you become a specialist in conflict resolution? A little bit different take on that.
Yeah, it is. I've done a lot of study and training, and I think one of the best ways is to realize that being able to effectively engage in conflict is a learned skill. So it's through a lot of practice and support and just continuing to work that way. And even before I joined the conflict field, I started to pay attention to patterns in my job of nonprofit management or college student affairs, and realized that I was pretty comfortable with being in that role of the third side to a conflict.
Okay. How would you describe or define the origin of conflicts in our national narrative?
Especially as we're gearing up for the 2020 election, I see a lot of conflict in our national stage is really fueled by fear and kind of a false sense of scarcity, and it's this belief, if I don't win, I'm going to lose. And it's so frustrating when we get to that place of fear and that dichotomy. And when we're in that kind of fight or flight place, it's very difficult to have the conversations and to really look at the situation more from a community base.
Okay. These conversations, as well as others, are often described as difficult conversations. What skills can we use to be more effective in these types of conversations?
Sure, I think that is right, and it's developing a skill. So it's so easy for us to feel overwhelmed by what's happening at the national, state, or even in our local government. And I really urge people to kind of start the practice of difficult conversations with those that we really have a lot of contact with, our family members, our colleagues, neighbors. And even though there's people that we know and trust, it can be very challenging to have a conversation. So one model I like to teach people comes from the Harvard Negotiation Project, Difficult Conversations, and it talks about in every conversation there's actually 3 conversations that are going on. So we do a lot of debate about what happened, and we're going to look at things differently. And if we can transition from debating what happened, but to creating an understanding together, that what happened conversation goes well. And a conversation that is often ignored in our society is the emotion conversation. We think emotions have no business in work or politics, but our emotions are what's fueling everything and help us understand what's important to us. And then the third conversation that's happening simultaneously is that identity conversation. And we want to be seen as someone who is competent, someone who is likable, someone who is a good person. And when those buttons get pushed, it kind of raises that conflict. So it's hard to do in the moment, but it's when you start to feel a pattern of difficult conversations, you can kind of think through models like this that I just described and go into the conversation prepared. But I also urge people to decide, is this even something I want to raise? Some things, it might make sense to just let go for a while, but if we stay in that pattern of accommodation, it can pay a price.
Okay. How might these skills vary by context, such as if you're talking with high school students, college students, parents, or work colleagues?
I think that's a great question. What's so important in conflict engagement is to be authentic. You have to speak from your own perspective and in your own voice. Because if any of us try to impose a formula on somebody, it's going to make the matter worse. So that's the first thing to think about. And then, wherever possible, just really meet the person where they are. Of course, we're going to interact with a high school student a little more differently than we would with someone at work. And even at work, I need to be aware of my power. Is this someone I supervise? Is this someone who supervises me? Is this a colleague? And really taking a look at how power can impact conflict. One of my colleagues, Bernie Mayer, has written about the influence of power in conflict, and he's identified 14 forms. It's so easy for us to think about that hierarchical power, but there's power of being able to define the situation, being a nuisance, having affiliation power. So really sorting that through can make a big difference to look at the context. And I think also conflict can be so overwhelming. It's very difficult for us to think about what's our goal. So as you asked, what's important to look at the context, it's also important to think about what am I trying to achieve here? Am I trying to create some family harmony? Am I trying to work something out with my neighbor to make sure I can maintain peace in my home and my property value? Am I trying to advocate for a position at my workplace? Am I wishing something were true in my community and I'm going to advocate that way? So really looking at the purpose. Do I want to raise this question? And if so, how can I invite the other person to work with me?
Okay, so you've talked about the power that's in that particular context. You've talked about the goal and then the context as a whole. How does identity play out with those three things together, do you think?
Well, I think that identity piece is so near and dear to us, and I use it kind of for my own self-awareness. We can't really successfully engage in conflict until we're aware of our own approach to it, our own comfort level. And it's something I love working in and teaching, and it's still, when it's my own stuff, it's really challenging. So I always urge people to be kind to themselves and to realize that we can kind of start to make a difference and start to achieve some of our goals a little bit at a time. And there's a couple of skills that we can use that I think are oftentimes forgotten or ignored. And one is the power of acknowledgement. So if somebody is saying something that I very much disagree with, that's starting to punch the buttons of the identity. But I can acknowledge somebody's perspective. I can acknowledge that they feel strongly about it. I can acknowledge that they've done a lot of research or this is part of their identity without agreeing. Okay. And we hesitate to do that because we think we're going to fuel the fire. But what we all want as humans is fundamentally to be heard. So that power of acknowledgement can make such a difference. When I teach our students, I use the analogy of a drive-through window. When you place your order at the squawk box and you know exactly what you want, you don't feel very comfortable moving your car forward until you hear that order come back to you. So acknowledging, restating, you're not parroting, you're not belittling anyone, you're saying, I hear you. I might not agree with you, but here's the foundation for what we can work on.
Okay. What kinds of conflict resolution resources are available in Nebraska?
You know, Nebraska has a really strong tradition of conflict resolution. Probably about 25 years ago, the Nebraska unicameral passed the Dispute Resolution Act, and that created an Office of Dispute Resolution that resides in the Nebraska State Supreme Court, so it's not kind of impacted by political appointments and can really have that kind of ongoing consistency. Also, from that office, there's some support both in policy and access to types of projects and a little bit of funding for nonprofit mediation centers across Nebraska. So Nebraska is a state that every county is linked to a nonprofit mediation center. So Concord Mediation Center here in the Douglas-Sarpy County area serves people, and they charge on a sliding fee scale to really make those conflict skills or services available to anybody.
How would I find that information?
You can go to the Nebraska State Supreme Court's website. Okay. And then if you're in this area, you can look for Concord Mediation Center.
Okay. Yeah. All right. You mentioned this earlier. Your colleague Bernie Mayer has written that conflict involves paradox.
That's right.
How would you describe paradox to begin with?
Right. It's kind of one of those, I think it's the aspect of conflict that makes it feel so confusing for us. And
Okay.
we are very, as a society, we love clarity, we want outcomes, we want to be efficient. But there's times when we're really going to engage in a complex conflict. Again, this would maybe if there was a longer term relationship or a big involved community project or something along those lines. But so an example of a paradox might be in the same moment, we're going to be competitive and cooperative. And that's how a community can really thrive. We might have different views of what's going to happen with a walking trail in our neighborhood, or if there's going to be a group home being developed in the area. So we have our own interests that we're going to compete for, but to really effectively address and resolve the conflict, we can look at how we can be cooperative as well.
At the same time.
At the same time. And it's hard to hold those two in tension, especially when it's your own conflict. So a lot of times I really urge people to reach out for help with conflict, because when it's your own matter, it's very hard to sort through. I mean, again, we can develop the skills and we can continue to move along, but there's all kinds of opportunities. For instance, there's a whole industry developing of conflict coaching, just like we have professional coaching. So someone who's not they're emotionally involved in the conflict, but can kind of help analyze. Or maybe you have a big meeting coming up or a group project. It might make sense to either tap one of those group members as a facilitator or to bring in a facilitator. And that doesn't mean anyone around the table can't do that or doesn't have the skills. It means that everybody really needs to be into that cooperative discussion. And then, as I was mentioned earlier with the Office of Dispute Resolution Systems, they focus very much on mediation. So you have a neutral third party there to make a decision for you. So, not for you, but to help you make your decision. They're going to facilitate your negotiation. So they don't have a vested outcome, but really want to come up with a creative plan that suits the interests as much as possible of everybody that's involved in the dispute. And that's very different. A lot of times in society we hear about arbitration. That's a very different model.
Okay.
That's when people would go to an arbitration panel and have a decision made for them. Almost every human that I know is involved in an arbitration clause. When you're scrolling through to get your software or your cell phone, it's effective, but it's different. So our focus in our at Creighton and the ODR centers is to really have people make the decisions as much as possible.
Okay. So it sounds to me like having this facilitator is someone who doesn't have a stake in the outcome.
Right,
Did
right.
I understand you correctly?
Yes, exactly. And that's one of my favorite forms of practice is to facilitate. And I'm still wanting the best for every individual around the table. And as the discussion flows, I have opinions, but it's not my job to bring those opinions in. It's my job to help everybody feel heard. So when I was saying, like, for instance, that using the acknowledgement or the restating, I'll use those kinds of skills and urge other people around the table to do it. We also just invite people to be really curious. A lot of times conflict can escalate because we're making assumptions about someone's intent, or we're assigning characteristics to them, and that might be true, but it's limiting. So when we start to have those thoughts and feelings bubble up, it might make sense to just kind of check yourself a little bit and say, again, what are my goals? And if I'm assuming that this person does not have my best interest, is that going to help me get to the goal? Or if I have evidence that they don't have my best interest, how we still have to work together, how can we have that happen? And that's a lot of it too. Again, we're very outcome oriented, so we can talk a lot about conflict engagement rather than conflict resolution. So there's some things, I mean, there can be land use issues or community values that may never be resolved, but we're all going to have to live together. And again, that's that competition and cooperation.
Okay, you've mentioned a couple of terms. One of them is, it sounds like you assume goodwill when you are in the conversation. Everybody should.
That's an idealized view, I agree. It's very difficult when someone has hurt you or gone against your interests or looks at the world so differently than you that it's barely tolerable. So I think that it's something to aspire to, but I would never want anyone to beat themselves up when they don't believe that someone has good intention. But sometimes even, it's like a little case study, sometimes just the curiosity about it. Like, I wonder what might be going on with that person, or I wonder what their goals are. That can sometimes open a door to some cooperation.
Kind of move your position a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that you just use the word position, because a lot of times we'll use that as a description of kind of as the conflict is starting to form. A position is what we sit on. It's what we practice in the shower. You know what? Today I'm going to go in there, I'm going to tell them. Positions aren't bad, but they're limited in terms of really broadening the pie and letting people kind of look at things from a variety of perspectives.
Okay. Before we go into some of the other paradoxes, you mentioned that one of the key skills to have is to acknowledge that you've heard. So are there some key phrases that you can use to acknowledge without agreeing?
Right, there are. And again, I think it's very important to use your authentic language, and then always kind of watch to see how did that land with the person. Am I assuring him or her that they're being heard, or am I unintentionally escalating the conflict? So some of the phrases that I use are, this is important to you. I understand you've done a lot of research on this. This form is confusing. This is a tough situation we're going to have to spend some time on. So I don't go into great detail about what I've heard, but I'm trying to signal to the other person, we have some work to do. And I'm almost inviting them to come and do the work with me, because what we tend to do is we want to teach. We want to teach someone why they're wrong. We want to teach them how things could be better. And a lot of times people don't want that lesson, or we might not have the full picture. So to kind of switch from that place of teaching, which is very well intended, but move from that place of teaching to an invitation, to inquire. And a huge skill that I ask people to think about is the power of open-ended questions.
Okay.
And so sometimes when I'm kind of tired and on a rainy weekend doing some binge watching on my TV, as I watch shows, I'll kind of think about what questions could I ask these characters. And it's just a good way to kind of, there we are enjoying some relaxation, but also building the skills. Because a lot of the questions that we form we say are open-ended, they can't be answered yes or no. They're open-ended, but we're really just trying to teach people. But if you can really think about it, an open-ended question is one you can't possibly know the answer to. And it just lays out a whole story that gives you and the folks that you're in conflict with an opportunity to start to do some work together.
One of my favorite phrases is "tell me more."
Yes, that's great. Yeah.
As a way to open a door.
Right. And that's so well crafted, because you're not using a word like why that could help people be a little more defensive. You're saying, I am curious, I need to understand. I think all of this is so hard to do in our fast-paced society, when we're running from one meeting to the next, from one social obligation, trying to get be a responsible neighbor and family member and colleague. It's very difficult to take that time in the moment, or even to reflect about what happened. So I always urge people to think about, we just don't have enough time in the day to manage every conflict that we encounter. Right. But really look at, where are those patterns? Every time you think, this is going to be different when I meet with her, and it doesn't. If you can identify those patterns, then you can kind of start to think about, how could I turn this and start to work together with this person?
It's always surprising to me how open that makes it, that there's always more story than you realized was there.
Yes, yeah, it's just amazing. And that's, again, how we're making sense of the world. So we always, just kind of assuming like what's happened, and once we learn the perspective, and it to me helps me become a much more compassionate and understanding person. I love the acronym, when in doubt in conflict, just CYA, and people think it's one meeting, but it's actually check your assumptions. So if you can CYA, it's going to get you through some tough conflict situations. And again, very difficult to do in the moment. But I just urge all of us to be reflective, to look at the patterns, and also recognize that there are high conflict people, and some people can't or won't ever want to resolve a conflict. And that's about Our research shows about 10% of the population. They're not reflective. It's kind of those folks, you know, in your life that are your own worst, they're their own worst enemy. They can't kind of read the room, read the situation. They actually prefer a high conflict situation. So that's a conversation for another day. But I just want people to know a lot of times if things aren't going well and the conversation's not productive, it might not be you. It might be the structure or the individuals involved. And that takes kind of a whole different perspective.
So it sounds like practice is a key aspect of this.
It really is, yeah. And spending that time and talking things through with a trusted colleague or friend and say, you know, again, it's that view of the third side, like a mediator, and do that informally with people that you work with.
Okay. Couple of the other paradoxes that you've addressed in other work. You talked about competition and cooperation. Emotions and logic is a key one. You've mentioned them each in different ways.
Yes, exactly, and that's like I mentioned in the difficult conversation, how the emotional conversation is something. Jonathan Haidt in his Happiness Project book has an image of a giant circus elephant and the rider on top who's directing the elephant. So think about the elephant being the emotions and the rider being the logic.
Okay.
So our society, we love facts and figures and details, and we honestly believe if we can get the facts and figures understood and clarified, then people will feel good about the conflict. But what happens is we ignore that big, looming, emotional elephant, and we're kind of talking over it to the rider. So both have to be present, but conflict can be nonsensical. It's an emotional thing. And so we say people come to fight about the money, but oftentimes it's not about the money. So, but we can't ignore that. We need the facts and the figures and the details and the what times and the what's your title and all of those kinds of things. But we also have to keep that paradox of the emotion involved as too. And conflict engagement is very different than therapy or any of those kinds of wonderful interventions as well.
So it sounds like navigation is a key word.
That's great. Yeah, exactly. And it's always different, and just being present and kind of that reflective practice, looking at, okay, why am I so mad about this? The tough question to ask oneself, what did I do to contribute to the situation? That can be a tough one to face because it's very easy to just be focused on the other person's assumptions and what they've done. But if we can take a little bit of humility and see what might have we done to contribute, and that gives us a chance to have those invitational conversations in the future to resolve the situation and make our neighborhood stronger, our community stronger, our department stronger. That's the goal.
Okay. Then let's talk about one more.
Okay.
There's actually several more, but we'll talk about one more.
Yeah.
And that is optimism and realism.
That's my favorite paradox about conflict, because I think any kind of, if it's my own personal conflict or if I'm helping somebody through something, there has to be that perfect blend of thinking there's a chance that this intractable conflict could get worked out. So that's the optimism, thinking there's a chance, and the realism is this is intractable, and kind of really looking to look at the balance of that. And because we're such an all or nothing society, many times we leave a lot of wonderful partial agreements on the table.
Okay, tell me more.
Yeah. Ooh, good practice. Yeah. So think about kind of like if I'm going to bring it to a workplace situation. Again.
Okay.
Okay. So let's say your department's really grappling with something, and it's like people are positional. It's all in or all out. Okay, that's natural. We're going to defend our positions. That's fine. But maybe there's a way to do some partial agreements or some short-term agreements. So we're not going to have winners or losers, but we're also not going to deny what's important to people around the table. So looking at what could be done in the next 2 weeks.
Okay.
And we're not going to solve the whole situation, but in 2 weeks. Or, gosh, we're have conflict around this, and this. Why don't we take item 3 and see and come. So it's a full agreement on item 3.
Okay.
But it's a partial agreement. And think about when you're in a conflict situation, how overwhelming that is. It's kind of all-consuming. So to break it down into manageable pieces can make a big difference.
Okay. What would you like us most to remember or take away from this conversation?
Wow, that is a great question. I guess I really hope that people trust their own responses to conflict and realize that there's a lot of potential good that can come from conflict. Again, bringing in the paradox of realism without overpromising it. And resolution and harmony might not be the outcome, but that's okay. There could be greater understanding, some compassion and empathy, and just urge people to trust their own voice.
Okay. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
This concludes our interview about conflict resolution and personal political disputes or discussions. The League thanks Mary Lee Brock for participating. From the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha, I'm Debbie Ford, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues and the candidates and go vote Omaha.